Center of Urban and Racial Equity 2020 Racial Justice Presidential Scorecard. And the scorecard encapsulates things like education, voter rights, healthcare, reparations, indigenous rights.
Issues that are important, that are significant, and that aren't always addressed by the candidates.
Human rights. So, okay, so my name is Ronnie Bennett, and I am the Executive Director of South Florida People of Color.
And my name is Giselle Kovac. I'm the Executive Director here at MTC and also a board member.
Yes. Okay, so I do want to say my pronouns is she, her, and hers, and we are having this event on Tequesta and Seminole land. You know, they are still here, and the government is still in their land. So hopefully you guys will include that in your racial justice practice. Okay? So, for those of you who are not familiar with South Florida People of Color, we are a racial healing nonprofit organization, and we do take donations, so thank you. And we are dedicated to disrupting racism in all its forms, and we do that through education and advocacy. See, I shortened it up. See that? So, I'm going to let you talk some.
Okay. I would like to thank the partners and the people who made this evening possible. Robert Bourne of Robert Bourne Real Estate. He supplied the wine for this evening, which clearly I really enjoyed. I'd like to thank the staff, my staff here at the Miami Theater Center for always doing an exceptional job in hosting events like this, which brings so much to our community. Miami Shores Community Alliance, who gave us the funding for our Black History Month events here in Miami Shores. I also want to tell you that we have a special opportunity tonight. There's a restaurant across the street called Sin's Gastro Bar, and they are going to put the Democratic debate on their TV screens in their restaurant. They have a full bar and a restaurant. So if you want to watch the debates together and collectively scream at the television, at the TV screens, and drink alcohol while doing so with your friends and neighbors, I invite you across the street after today's presentation.
Yeah, we'll see you there.
You are all invited.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, so now I'm going to introduce our MC and moderator, and his name is Charlton Copeland. And let me just read his, I shortened it up because, you know, they have like pages and pages. So
It's pretty accomplished.
yeah, too much here. So Charlton is a professor of law at the University of Miami, where he teaches civil procedures, constitutional law, administrative law, federal courts, federal policy making, and has taught classes on litigation and state Medicaid policy and federalism. Charlton's research and writing focuses primarily on the impact of legal and political institutions, primarily federalism, on American policy outcomes, including health policy, race and justice policies, education, among other things. That's where we cut it. So we'll bring him up, and then he will tell you all what we're going to do for the rest of this evening. All right?
Good evening. Good evening. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. This is my first time here, despite the fact that I am a neighbor to the south. And I was just telling someone I was coming here, and her response to me was, "They always have events on Wednesdays." And so there are people who may not be here who admire what you guys are doing, even in their absence. And again, I have been one of them, and so it's a real honor to be here. So thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to lay out what we're going to do this evening. As was stated, Dr. Sociologist, a racial justice advocate, and former president and founder and president of the Center for Urban and Racial Equity, CURE. She has 20 years of experience working at the intersection of racial equity, public health, communications, and policy advocacy. She is also a researcher in the departments of sociology and criminology at Howard University. where she leads a community-centered urban research initiative. Dr. Lubin, under Dr. Lubin's leadership, CURE released a 2020 Racial Justice Presidential Scorecard. It is a first of its kind analysis rating the major candidates for president on their policy positions through a racial equity lens. She is also the lead author of a national study examining the challenges and opportunities for diversifying the nonprofit sector, titled Talent Justice, Investing in Equity in the Nonprofit Workforce. Dr. Lubin is a former Congressional Black Caucus Fellow, Foundation Public Health Fellow, and a co-founder of the organization Sociologists for Justice. Dr. Lubin is a native Miamian. She is a first-generation Haitian American, and so she has grown up, as she says, in the cultural milieu of immigrants from the Caribbean and Central and South America here in South Florida. And she says these experiences have profoundly shaped her sense of justice, equity, and appreciation of the beauty and humanity of all people. Without delay, Dr. Lubin.
Good evening. Good evening. So this is a challenge because I cannot see your faces at all. But we're going to roll with it. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you, Ronnie, for your partnership. So good to be here in my hometown to launch CURE's Racial Justice 2020 series of community dialogues in partnership with South Florida people of color. I'll be in Spartanburg, South Carolina in a couple of days for another community dialogue before the primaries there. But it's so important for me to start this conversation here because I'm a Floridian and it's rare that I get to speak in front of my family. In the back, yay! So I do want to root myself here before I get into the scorecard. As it was mentioned, you know, I grew up here in Miami, and this is where I learned about racism. My parents migrated here in the early 70s, like so many other immigrants, in search of a better future and the promise of America. But growing up in Miami in the 80s and the 90s wasn't easy. You know, there was anti-Haitian sentiment, which was high during those times, and it wasn't just about kids saying mean things. You know, there were immigrant policies preventing Haitians from entering the country. There was health policy that stigmatized us as carriers of HIV/AIDS and unworthy to serve as blood donors. So growing up with this background, I learned early that racism was not just about one person saying something hateful because of skin color or ethnicity, but it's a system. Racism is a system of harmful policies, narratives, and day-to-day practices that exclude and marginalize Black and brown people. But I also grew up being inspired by the resistance that I saw here, like at the old Immigration Nationalization building where advocates would gather to protest anti-Haitian immigration policies. So in many ways, I'm what Trump and Republicans fear most. A Black woman, a daughter of immigrants, and a voter that's invested in making this country live up to its promise. Right. That's why this year is so vital for so many reasons. 2020 is the start of a new decade, the year of the 2020 census, and we have to be counted. 2020 also marks 150 years since the 15th Amendment granted Black men the right to vote, which we know still hasn't always been honored. This year also marks 100 years since women gained the right to vote. But above all, 2020 is the year of one of the most pivotal presidential elections of our lifetime, a year when it's never been more critical to exercise our power to be heard and our power to change the trajectory of this country. So, as I stand here, America is in a crisis, and we know it's in a crisis. I think we know this well. Next slide. This year, we celebrated the MLK holiday. Trump supporters were gathered with rifles in Richmond, the former capital of the Confederacy, for a gun rights rally. A few days before that rally, 3 white supremacists, part of a group called the Base, were arrested for plotting to kill demonstrators in order to start a civil war. This is where we are right now. And just last month, after 65% of Florida voters approved Amendment 4 to reinstate the voting rights of 1.5 million residents, a court ruled in favor of a poll tax that requires payments of fines and fees of more than, or average, $500 before residents could have their rights restored. Next slide. Next slide. And just a few weeks ago, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, charged with enforcing fair housing laws under the current Secretary Ben Carson, proposed new policies that will make it harder to file housing discrimination complaints and easier for banks to deny people of color loans. Next slide. Meanwhile, Donald Trump has appointed 2 Supreme Court judges, 158 judges to the federal bench, 44 circuit court judges, and 112 district court judges. According to the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, Trump has not nominated a single Black or Latinx person to the appellate courts. 86% of Trump's judicial appointees are white and male. And these are almost lifetime appointments because they'll sit on the bench for 30 to 40 years. So as we get close to the November election, we stand at an important inflection moment. We're asked to choose 2 different paths. Do we continue down a path of extremism, down a path of a white nationalist vision for America that suppresses our votes, wipes away our hard-fought rights, separates immigrant families at the border? Do we continue down a path that denies climate change, pulls back environmental regulations, cuts safety net programs like Social Security, and awards medals of honor to white supremacists like Rush Limbaugh? Next slide. Or do we choose another vision, a vision for a just future, a just America that honors the humanity and dignity of everyone, Black, brown, and indigenous people, immigrants, women, LGBTQ people, Muslims, poor and working class people? A bold vision for our communities and government where equity is at the center of healthcare, of economic and environmental policy, and at the center of transforming criminal justice, immigration, and so many other systems that are in desperate need of repair and reimagining how government should work for us and not against us. This should not be about Democrats or Republicans. These issues should matter to everyone, but we can't ignore the reality that one party has chosen to align itself with an ideology that is openly hostile to people of color and that is willing to use violence to assert their power. Next slide. This is about a set of policies about how, not only how we undo the damage of the past few years, but also how we tackle long-standing inequities that have real positive impacts in our lives and in our communities. This moment is about choosing hope and action over fear. This moment is about asking for something different, bolder, and transformative. That's why my team at the Center for Urban and Racial Equity developed the 2020 Racial Justice Scorecard. So here we are, a small and mighty team of 6 people, 6 racial justice advocates, researchers, and practitioners who are committed to transforming organizations and government. And so this scorecard looks at the presidential candidates through 10 key areas: criminal justice, education, healthcare, voting rights, reparations, environmental justice, immigration, indigenous rights, policies to close the racial wealth gap, and the candidates' past record and language on race. We developed the scorecard to provide voters with a tool to make a decision, particularly during the primary elections, because there's so many candidates to choose from. But to hold these candidates accountable, because one of them is going to be the nominee. We want to hold them accountable to prioritize issues important to Black and brown voters. So I'm not here to tell you how to vote or who to vote for. That's a personal decision that you make, but we created this scorecard so you can review the candidates' grades and policies and come to your own conclusions. Next slide. Having this information helped me make a decision, and the scorecard really did help me make a decision, because there were a lot of candidates to choose from. But even more than the candidate grades and scores is embedded within the scorecard a racial justice agenda. Policy positions that are most likely to begin to move us toward a just future that we deserve, a just future that we must demand. Next slide. We have handouts out up front, and so you can see the different policies that we looked at as part of this scorecard in order to grade the candidates. So how do we get to this just future, and how do we win? Next slide. One of the overarching narratives of this election is that we just need somebody who can beat Donald Trump, right? We just need somebody who can beat Donald Trump. And so for some people that means we need a centrist who can appeal to the white working class voters and not talk about our issues that are far too left. That's what some say. So it's this kind of thinking that tells black and brown people to accept a candidate like Michael Bloomberg, who doubled down on defending the racist and unconstitutional policy of stop and frisk. Yep. Even when residents and civil rights groups sued the city to stop the practice. And it's this kind of thinking that has white moderates in the past few days telling us to just get over stop and frisk, when their kids will never, never be subjected to the dehumanizing and traumatic impact of being thrown against the wall simply for being black and Latino. Over 5 million stops occurred during the 3 terms of Bloomberg's administration. According to the New York Times, nearly 90% of the people who were stopped were innocent. So black and brown people in New York were living under a police state under Bloomberg. And I don't accept that apology.
That's right.
So, if you're following the elections, on the Democratic side of the message, we're told, we just need to beat Donald Trump, or I'll vote for a ham sandwich as long as it's not Donald Trump. People are afraid of losing, I get it. People are afraid of losing, and this fear has many of us believing that we need a safe candidate. But I want more than a safe candidate that will play it safe when so much about what we're facing right now is about making our communities feel unsafe. So there's a dangerous narrative tied to these messages that we've been hearing. It's one that seeks to erase our experiences, a message that we shouldn't be asking for something better than what we had before Trump, and that we shouldn't hold the Democrat that hopefully gets elected in November accountable to our issues and our communities. Yes, we're in a state of emergency and we want Trump out, but we should want more than to be Trump. We need to know where the candidates stand. So that's what the Racial Justice Scorecard tries to do. We look at the candidates across the 10 areas that I mentioned, next slide, and we use what we call a racial equity lens. So we looked at the candidates' policy positions. We wanted to see that they were naming racism as a driver of racial differences and outcomes, for example, educational outcomes in each policy area that we looked at. We wanted to see that they were proposing strategies and policies to address inequities. So overall, the candidates with positions that focus on systemic change scored higher on our scorecard than candidates that wanted to maintain or preserve the status quo. So let's look at some of these issues. Next slide. So on healthcare, particularly when we look at health disparities, in black communities, black and brown communities in particular, we face higher rates of diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, infant mortality, and maternal deaths after childbirth. Poor health runs deep in our communities, but it's not because of genetics, it's because of racism. Racism exposes us to stressors and living conditions that chip away at our health and well-being. And even when we receive care, we often receive unequal treatment. For example, research shows that Black women receive less aggressive treatment for breast cancer compared to white women at the same stage of the disease. So we had an important milestone under President Obama, which was the Affordable Care Act, and that was a huge fight just to even pass that policy. And that was an improvement in ensuring access to health care for millions of people. But we still have 30 million people who are uninsured, and the premiums on the exchanges are going up and making health care plans unaffordable and out of reach for many people. The ACA was not meant to be the end game. It was a stopgap measure. This country doesn't have universal health care because of racial politics, because too many white people on the right have bought into the big government dog whistles that people of color will benefit too much from these programs at their expense. So instead, we have a broken healthcare system that doesn't work for anyone, not just for poor Black and middle-class people, but for poor and middle-class white people as well. So we need a universal healthcare system that isn't based on people's ability to pay. We need a just healthcare system, and Medicare for all is what will get us there. Medicare for all will put an end to the racial politics that has shaped our health policy since the 1930s, when Social Security and a universal healthcare system was being discussed during the New Deal. I'm not going to get too wonky. This was like my dissertation topic, how race shaped universal healthcare, so I wrote about 200 pages on this. But I just want to reinforce that this is such an important issue for our communities, and this Medicare for all is really a part of an unfinished fight for civil rights and racial justice in this country. Next slide. Only two candidates, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, have made Medicare for all a key part of their platform. So Sanders has not offered much detail on how he would get Medicare for all done, whereas Warren has laid out a two-step strategy of first starting with a government-administered public option for children and low-income adults, and for people under 50 who want to buy into the program, and then would phase into a full expansion of Medicare for all. There are always questions about how you pay for these programs, but she's laid out a plan for how the funds would be raised for Medicare for all. Most of the other candidates have proposed a public option as well, such as Biden, Klobuchar, and Bloomberg. Some of them are saying they're going to leave it to the states to administer the public option, but we saw what's happened with Medicaid. With the Medicaid expansion under the Affordable Care Act, there's still 14 states that haven't expanded Medicaid, and those are primarily states with large populations of Black and Latino people. Next slide. So let's look at the racial wealth gap. Next slide. In 2016, the median wealth of white families was 10 times that of Black families. $171,000 compared to $17,600. Let that sink in. $171,000 to $17,600. Many Black families living in poverty have zero wealth or negative wealth. So wealth isn't just something out there that we can't experience. We should be able to access wealth. Wealth provides financial security to weather emergencies, to help pay for your kids' college, to start a business, to retire, without worrying about how you will meet your basic needs as you age. Next slide. So William Darity, Derek Hamilton, and their team at Duke University, who've been studying the racial wealth gap, say we don't get at the racial wealth gap because it's such an entrenched aspect of our society by telling people to work harder, get a college education, or build or make better financial decisions. This is part of systemic racism. And so in order for us to really address the racial wealth gap or the racial wealth divide, they say America has to undergo a vast social transformation produced by bold national policies that finally begin to address long-standing consequences of slavery, Jim Crow, and ongoing racism and discrimination that exist in our society today. We need a candidate that will take wealth building in our community seriously. That means tackling student loan debt. That's not, yes, tackling student loan loan debt, especially student loan debt, which is hitting Black borrowers the hardest. After incurring student loan debt, oftentimes Black workers face discrimination in hiring and are paid less than whites with similar qualifications. Black borrowers are 2 times more likely to default on student loans compared to white borrowers. So student loan is a serious issue for our community, and it's deepening the racial wealth gap and making it harder for us to afford a home and to save for retirement. We need a president who understands how structural racism works in the job market and the broader economy, and what it takes to preserve affordable housing in Black and brown communities, like in Overtown and Little Haiti, that are being gentrified and pushing out people who have held these neighborhoods together when government and businesses said they weren't worth investing in. So policies like canceling the student loan debt, tuition-free public universities are critical to building a just future. But to get at the racial wealth gap, we need even more innovative thinking. Next slide. For example, Elizabeth Warren proposed a plan to create a home buying program for low-income buyers living in formerly red line or segregated neighborhoods that is explicitly designed to address the Black-white racial wealth gap. We also see some of the other candidates following and proposing similar types of policies. So Pete Buttigieg has a Douglas plan that hits a number of different areas that we look at in the scorecard, and it's race explicit. Bloomberg, who recently announced, has a Greenwood initiative that also includes home ownership as well as job creation and entrepreneur programs, which a number of the other candidates include as well. So next slide, moving on to criminal justice. So we know that one of the most profound ways that race and racial inequality gets perpetuated in this society is through the criminal injustice system, right? Particularly because of the wide-ranging impacts of incarceration. So an arrest record jeopardizes your ability to get a job, to secure housing, access certain educational programs, and so much more. We know that across the law enforcement continuum, whether it's how our communities are policed, to arrest rates, cash bail, how long you stay in detention before a trial, and how long of a sentence you get are all shaped by race. So the system is doing exactly what it is designed to do, which is to lock Black people up. So on our scorecard, we looked at a number of different issues. We wanted to see the candidates addressing these, and you see some of them listed here. Most of the candidates, because there's been this conversation happening over the past few years, particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been a lot of conversation around the inequities in the criminal justice system. So most of the candidates scored where we wanted them to score. We wanted to see their policy positions on some of these key issues, but there are a couple of standouts. Next slide. I just want to highlight the position on marijuana legalization. So Biden and Bloomberg are one of the few candidates that don't support full marijuana legalization. And so this is important, that we need marijuana to be legalized at the federal level, because this is partly why we continue to see the marijuana arrest disparities because of the federal ban. And advocates that have been working on this issue say that a full legalization, not just decriminalization, is what we need in order to begin to really start to address these racial disparities. So you have, in some states where marijuana has been decriminalized, you're still seeing Black people being arrested twice as often as white people are. Next slide. So in our scorecard, we looked for candidates for strategies to promote police reform, legalize marijuana, and cash bail, to the extent they can, pressure federal government to pressure local governments to end cash bail, address the crack cocaine sentencing disparity. So this still exists. It was reduced a bit during the Obama administrations, but this is still a huge difference, a huge racial disparity between crack cocaine sentencing. Next slide, really quickly, another issue that I want to touch on is environmental justice, and you can see some of the issues that we assess the candidates on here. So climate change is hitting our communities the hardest. So oftentimes we hear these conversations about climate change, and they don't really talk about how they affect Black and Latino communities. But there are real racial and economic injustices that undergird climate change. Our communities often are hit hardest because we're already experiencing other environmental injustices. And it's our communities, when we get these monster hurricanes that come through, that take the longest to recover, and we also see the slowest response oftentimes in our communities to address emergency situations sometimes. So we need policies and investments that recognize the unfair burden that communities bear and that link economic and environmental justice so that we can benefit from the jobs and the business opportunities in the emerging green economy. Next slide. Next slide. So while Trump and white nationalists have been stoking fears among white working class Americans that they're losing power, that immigrants and black people and Muslims are the biggest threats, the reality is we're losing ground on so many issues: civil rights, voter protections, housing affordability, healthcare access. We're in a crisis moment, and we have to vote and mobilize with this in mind. We have an opportunity and an opening to offer a counter-narrative and a policy agenda that's rooted in economic and social justice. Reverend William Barber, who started the Forward Together movement, the moral movement that brought together white, black, gay, straight, rich, poor people in a grassroots progressive coalition that first started in North Carolina, but then it spread to a number of different parts of the country. He talks about a fusion politics that brings people together to build a movement where we learn how our issues interact, we critique public policy regardless of who is in power, we resist divide and conquer strategies, and we let our deepest moral values guide us. With these principles, we can stay focused on an agenda with a just future in mind. We have to resist the urge to believe that we can only win by playing into a narrative that fundamentally says our issues and our votes don't decide or can't decide the next election. We can build power this election season by speaking to voters about the issues and pushing candidates to take our issues seriously. That's why we created the Scorecard. We're currently getting over 7,000 visitors a day on the Scorecard website. Campaigns including Warren, Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and Steyer have acknowledged the Scorecard and have sent us policies. Some of them have sent us policies for us to look at to consider their scores. So they know the Scorecard exists, and they know that voters are taking it seriously. So this is just one effort. This is the effort that CURE is trying to make our Scorecard matter, to make our issues matter in this election. There are lots of other grassroots work that's happening, and we'll hear from some of our colleagues and partners that are working here locally during the panel. But you know, this issue it's so important that we understand where these candidates stand and that we demand that they pay attention to our issues. So we have to know our power, and we have to use our power. The increasing Latino vote is one of the greatest fears of the GOP. So that's why they've been crafting so hard on immigration. But they have also realized that black voters matter. Black voters decide elections because compared to other voters of color, we make up a larger share of voters in swing populations. And we saw this in 2016, when many black voters, especially young black voters, decided to sit the election out. In states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, those states went from blue to red. We can't afford to have this happen again. So the primary election in Florida is our opportunity to stand up and be heard for your vote, an opportunity to vote for the candidate that represents your values and that you would be excited to vote for in the general election. We get to adjust future not by just voting our fears, but our hopes. We get to adjust future by mobilizing and organizing and staying focused on a shared agenda. We get to adjust future by letting our hopes for our communities and our country guide our choices and our actions. In this new year and new decade, we have an opportunity to shape the political landscape with our votes. Do your homework, check out the Scorecard, don't take my word for it. There's plenty of documentation on the website, lots of information on there for you to dig in on the different candidate positions. I don't have time to go into all of them. We look at both the positives and the negatives of each of the candidates. And so I encourage you to check out the scorecard, to vote your values, vote the candidate that you're passionate about, and encourage everyone to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lubin, for that inspiring and informative and intersectional presentation of a progressive policy agenda that ought to guide our political choices and the lens through which we evaluate candidates who submit themselves for our evaluation as president. We're going to move into our panel. So I want to start, in some sense, with where Dr. Lubin started. That is, given the fact that we clearly have a major political party that has committed itself to the project and policies of the current occupant of the White House. Is this an opportunity for an expansive social justice agenda? Or is this a moment where social justice advocates are being told, and particularly minority social justice advocates, are being told, we know you're not going anywhere. And when one looks at the discourse of major political party candidates, in some sense, you get the sense that everyone is saying to minority voters, in the ways that Donald Trump said in the 2016 election, what do you have to lose? I'm so sorry. Right? Meaning, where are you going to go, and there are no reasonable alternatives. So it really does not matter, as you said, who the nominee is. And social justice agendas, expansive conceptions of the state's commitment to people who are suffering economically are luxuries that can't really be afforded this time around. That this is a kind of democracy-saving election, and that's where everybody ought to be. And as a kind of frame for the way in which we aspire and ought to advocate during this election cycle, what does it look like as the frame, and what are the threats of that for our politics? Oh, okay. 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 So I'm opening that to the panel.
I definitely can start with that. First of all, we're talking about social justice and transformational change. We're talking about there's never a time where something doesn't matter, right? Because things haven't changed in the way that we needed them to since the beginning of the founding of American culture, when policies were instituted that were impacting what wealth is going to look like for generations today. So the thing that is most important about this election, in my opinion, and in community, is being able to have folks get out to vote. There was Dr. Lubin, thank you for the work that you've done in your team of 6. There was a mention of the fact that younger Black voters didn't show up at the polls, and I also think that it's important to think about the issue of voter purging that happened across a multitude of states. I have a personal example of my young person who should be able to be voting in this election, though she's away at college. She's registered to vote in Florida, and I helped her do the registration. We did it on the computer, we typed it up, and then when it was time for her to vote in the midterm elections, on the day that it was time for her to send in her vote, it was like something was changed on her date of birth, and it was something that was typed. So we know that there was some type of, messing up her voter registration shenanigans that was occurring. So one of the major issues, not only getting out in the community, linking up with what's happening in our local communities and some of the issues that are really going to impact us locally and the policies that are going to come through locally, but making sure that when we are going to the polls, that folks are able to actually vote, and then also to know and understand what their local policies are, to vote on those, so that then those can be elevated to the state and the federal level in the ways that we need them to, specifically for Black and brown communities. I also just want to name quickly before I go here, we're sitting in a very privileged, I'm assuming educated group of folks coming and having this conversation. We've been able to look at the research that was put out and just naming the fact that there are folks that are impacted by this policy who might not be in this room and who are definitely not sitting on this stage in the same way. And I'm talking about the immigrant population the immigrant population that is being impacted by the policies of our administration today. I'm talking about our indigenous folks. I'm talking about our younger voter population. And those voices need to be elevated and heard in our community much more readily than the folks of us who are considered super voters. Because I got something in the mail at home that said I'm a super voter. I don't know what it means, other than I do know every time there's an opportunity to go to an election, I'm there and I'm bringing my young people with me so that they understand the importance of going to the polls.
So we're just coming off of 400 years of the African presence in America, 1619. And we're still literally having a conversation about can Black people or people of color get full citizenship in the country? As human beings, we should be embarrassed because there are nations that are quote unquote less developed than us that don't seem to be having such a hard time integrating folks into their society, number one. Secondarily, when we think about social justice, there's never a good time to do what is right, right? And what I mean by that is, for the things that people are asking for, they're basic tenets. Basic tenets. And everyone wants to seem like there's some sort of extreme leftist, outside the box. Oh my God, he wants healthcare to be a right. Oh my God, we want people to have access to the ballot in a so-called first world democracy. Oh my God, we want students not to be swamped in college debt for 30 years of their life. I saw an analogy recently. It's like we're one of the only countries in the world that encourages folks to go into debt to go get a job that they can't pay their debt off. Right. But yet we do it. And so we have to get out of that bad habit. So, frank it to the point, and then I'll kick it off to my colleagues here on the stage. I've said this recently. We had a convening in West Palm Beach, the New Florida Majority did. And I basically said, if your success or your movement requires my continued oppression, then I cannot rock with you. I can't cajole with you. I can't be willing to compromise. I can't be willing to sit here and nod and say, I'll wait my turn. Because I come from a tradition and a group of people who let's put it into mathematical terms for the mathematic folks in here, who for 25 generations have had to wait their turn. And so how long is too long, right? And so when I see people advocating for we have to be Trump and that has to be the goal, and whoever's going to be fitting enough to do that, but will allow the mistreatment of black and brown people, the historical mistreatment of black and brown people by candidates to stand in the way of real movement and real change, I can't be okay with that. And there's nothing you can do to argue me down that makes me think that someone who, and let me reiterate this number to you, someone who violated the civil rights of 5 million people during his tenure as mayor should have no space to be able to walk up to the so-called Democratic nomination and us be okay with it. And I can't even say it's 5.2 million people actually. So I don't want to discount the other 200,000 people whose civil rights were violated purely on the basis of color. And what is supposed to be the greatest city in our country. And allow somebody to walk away with that, nor will I allow someone to not, be held accountable for anything that they may have done in their city or their space or their place. What I'm looking for is somebody who's willing to step up and be held accountable for the historic wrongdoings of this country. Yes, because you're trying to get to the position of the commander-in-chief of this country, but also be willing to do something about it, period, point.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So as we're entering this election cycle, and we always get caught up in cycles. And this is now just another part of the cycle and the continuous conversations that we're going to be having around elections and not having conversations about power. And people who have power and how they wield that power and how they use it to oppress others and basically stop the movement and advancement of our country. And so when we talk about expansion of social justice and being able to leverage this moment to be able to force conversations that normally wouldn't happen, that's the opportunity that we're using at this moment. It's not about whether we're gonna win, whether we're gonna lose, whether we're going to be pushing back, and whether or not we should just shut up and let the process go. Is that we have to have ownership over what's happening. And right now, we always have to ask ourselves of what is this country becoming? And actually, what has this country always been? And I don't know, folks, reading the Washington Post, and when they did this whole change around the framing of their newspaper, and when they said democracy dies in darkness, that's ultimately what's happening in the United States right now. We have so many distractions that we're not actually focusing on what our nation has become, which is more and more of a plutocracy. The wealthy are controlling our nation, and we're handing it over to them because we are in a constant state of fear. We are fearful that we're losing, and we have already been losing, and we're continuing to lose. And so what does it look like when in other countries, and we see them on the news, that people are burning down the streets? They're burning down the streets because they're in the middle of a revolution, because they're no longer standing and sitting and waiting for government to do what they feel the government needs to do, and they're taking that power. And they're okay with creating a little bit of instability to get to that stable place. But in America, we want to be safe. We don't want to disrupt. We'll do the protest every once in a while, but we're not willing to rattle the cage to actually get to the place that we need to get to in this country. So while we talk about the national election context, I do local work. We have down ballot races that we're not talking about. There's about to be a complete shift in our local government where for the first time in over 20 years, that term limits are about to kick in the county commission. And more than half of those seats are about to turn over, but we're not talking about that. We're not talking about our state legislature where we're about what? About 4 or 5 seats away in the Florida Senate to be able to gain control? 3 now. But we're not talking about that because we're caught up in a federal conversation. And we don't understand that our state and our local are basically our first line of defense, and they are starting to lose, and they're losing ground every day because we're gaining more and more majorities in our state legislatures, and local control, local democracy, preemption is happening at the local level where our local governments can't even be our line of defense. because their powers are being stripped away. And so while we have this federal conversation, we also need to get grounded in our local context, because we, basically how Trump has set this stuff up. And you said it, Dr. Lubin. When we look at our courts, they've already set their stage for the next 40, 50 years. So where are we going to be ready to fight? Where are we going to be ready to hold the ground and stand that line? And it's going to be at the state and local levels. And how do we organize and mobilize around that context to be able to be ready and push back against the federal level? So that means the organizing that's happening. That needs to happen. The building the bench. As a former treasurer of the Florida Democratic Party, and for those who may not know, I exited very publicly from the Florida Democratic Party by saying that they don't care about black people. I made that very clear, as 3 state black officers that were completely left out of the loop. You had an African American, a Jamaican American, and a Haitian Dominican American, and a white woman. The 3 black state officers were completely left out of the conversation about strategy of how do we move this state forward. So if we're doing that at the state level, just imagine what they're doing at the federal level with the Democratic National Committee. So we see pathways are being created for billionaires to find their ways onto our debate stages, because corporate Democrats feel that we need someone to be in the center. We need someone who's center right to be able to win this country. And that's not what we need in this country, because when we're talking about community wealth, generational wealth, the criminalization of poverty, when we're talking about our environment, cultural erasure of our communities, that's not just a federal conversation, it's a state and local conversation, and how we're regaining and taking control of our power. And I always give the V for Vendetta, I don't know if anybody has watched V for Vendetta. Remember, the 5th of November. If you've ever watched Hunger Games, and what it means to take back our power, to reset the stage so that we can build our communities and move forward. And I'm asking you all in this space to really contemplate, what does that look like? Because we can sit here and we can fight for power, but when we have it, are we ready? And are we willing to do what is necessary when we actually get it? Because that is part of the conversation. We can fight every day for that power, but when we finally gain it, do we know what to do with it?
That's right. That's right.
I think you forgot to drop the mic on that. My sister Francesca, she really gives it to you raw. I want to say something, reiterate some of the things that she said, but I want you to understand it's not about just Bloomberg. Most of those candidates have blood on their hands. Whether you did stop and frisk, or whether you voted for the Clinton crime bill, you affected disproportionately black families. Okay? And you'll see the incarceration rates, how they've risen drastically as a result of that. Broken up homes for someone that may have had problems with addiction. So now, today they're getting it with the heroin. You know, let's do treatment first instead of incarceration. But during the crack era, you know, families were torn apart. So I'm going to say this. Social justice. First of all, look around the room. Look around the room and see this room. So I'm glad that we have a very diverse audience. But I want to say this. Social justice starts in rooms like this. Okay? One of the things I want you to know about combating racism, no matter how much a black person or brown person screams, if a white person doesn't stand in defense, when they hear, see, or experience something from one of their colleagues and say, no, I'm not for that, and I won't allow that around me. Until that happens on a regular basis, that's where we're going to have that, you know, the change that we're looking for is not truly going to happen. Francesca talked about the DNC. For the last 4 gubernatorial elections, we should have had a Democratic governor. The last 4, just based on the vote in Miami. I want you to think about that, just based on the vote right here in Miami. But you have people coming from national, bringing people who don't know the community, disregarding the votes of the people that can make that difference. So we need to speak to that. We need to speak to those folks who are in power and ask, who are you really working for? What is it that you really want to accomplish? The other thing I want to say is, it's the lesser of evils when we look at the political candidates. And the other thing that we need to do, just as Francesca said, at building wealth in impoverished communities, you affect the entire community. All right? So what happens is you change crime rates. You give more opportunities for folks to further their education. You provide more opportunities for home ownership. You have people that begin to eat and live healthier lives. So we definitely need that economic engine to help bolster. But the thing that has hurt us time and time again for those entrepreneurs is cash flow issues and sustainability issues in terms of not always having the expertise or not always making the right decisions and so on and so forth. We've been given opportunities, but oftentimes we've been given opportunities knowing that we will fail because we do not have the resources that we need to sustain those businesses.
Can I piggyback on that real quick? So, Ruben brought up a very intentional point, and I want to double down on it. Systemic racism is a thing, not this sort of new idea that people come up with, or not some sort of academic term that's come out in the last 20 years. It's literally the thing that is, that our economy, that our society has been propped up on since 1690, right? But it also creeps into a number of different things. And what I would say to kind of answer the question that you posed is that we need a level of political courage similar to what Maynard Jackson did in Atlanta by our politicians. And I would definitely encourage people to check out the documentary Maynard if you don't know the story. And so when the Hartsfield Airport was being built, there was, of course, an intentional desire to leave Black entrepreneurs and vendors out of that altogether. Even the folks who were reporting back to the then newly elected mayor were saying, we can't find Black vendors to do these services. And Maynard Jackson had a simple question he asked. You're telling me there's no Black people who cut grass in the entire city of Atlanta? And what he meant by that was, you're telling me that we're going to build an airport that's going to have grass adjacent to it, and we can't find people, Black people in Atlanta that cut grass. Right. I refuse to believe. You're telling me you can't find Black people who lay tar. And he forced people to get out and find people who've been hiding in plain sight. So to answer your question, what I think organizations like NAACP, and I have to say that I'm also a president, South Dade president of NAACP. We split the county in half between Ruben and I. We need to come up with a list of vendors, an active list, an ongoing list, a continuous list of folks who are doing this work on a continuous basis. Moreover, we have to understand the historical ramifications of things like redlining, the notion that banks have used color as a convenient excuse to not give out loans since their inception. Yet still they will use the dollars that you put in your savings account to continue your demise, right? And that is a thing that we need to hold accountable. You know, when the threat to pull their accounts out of Wells Fargo in Atlanta during this time period, or fight to pull their money from Bank of America if they could not extend loans to these vendors who needed that. That was the threat Maynard Jackson used, right? He's like, we're gonna pull the city's resources out of your banks since you can't seem to loan these folks some money. But we also, as Ruben pointed out earlier, we need other folks to chime in, to know that these historical indiscretions have been happening with persistence. It can't be a head scratch. It can't be like oh, I'm a police officer and there's this other black police officer. I can't seem to figure out why he got denied for the apartment and I didn't. Like this woeful ignorance that we all have about racism not being a thing, or trying to live in this rainbow coalition land of kumbaya, which by the way is influenced by black people in the Gullah Islands of South Carolina, by the way, you should know about that. Like this notion of holding hands and locking arms until it's inconvenient for you has to stop. Has to stop. If we're going to do this, there has to be a recognition that bad things have happened to good people for far too long, and that we can no longer allow that to persist in our country, in our state, in our city. And we have to elect people and hold them accountable to that. So let me go back to the original point. That Fran made, we got local elections. We got local elections. There's a $9 billion county budget. That's billion with a B. And yet you have people talking about privatizing bus lanes. You have a $7 billion school board budget with a B, and yet we allow charter schools to invade our communities on a regular basis, extracting resources from our own community that educate our children. We let 2.5 million children suffer annually because we elect state legislators based on things like, and this is literally what somebody told me when I was trying to drop some knowledge on them. She looked like she had a good smile and a trustworthy face, so that's why I voted for her. Like, check the records, that's all I'm saying. Like, do the basic research. We all walk around with smartphones in our pocket, but we still act dumb every November. So when it's time to vote for something.
So are there any more questions from the floor?
Good evening to everyone. I am Marlene Braga, humbled to serve Elizabeth Warren, who's ready for President of the United States, as community organizer. And I just wanted to say that we are with you in solidarity and you have our full support.
What
are you saying, Dwight?
I was saying the new Florida majority has endorsed the movie. It's publication. You can come get a yard sale.
No free ads. No free ads.
So, my name is Joseph. So my name is Joseph. I just want to be clear with everyone. If anyone on the panel can answer who has endorsed a prisoner's Bill of Rights, given that the state of Florida disproportionately is affected, and we have a disproportionate amount of individuals, specifically people of color and black folks, that are disenfranchised by the carceral system. And what role does that play moving forward in terms of politics, and who's taking a real stance that we can stand behind and vote for in the state of Florida?
Well, I mean, in terms of the Bill of Rights piece, no one I've known in terms of that exact policy, but I would say we understand the harm of the 94 Crimes Bill. Two candidates have chosen to say that they will repeal the 94 Crimes Bill almost in its entirety, including supporting the proposal by Representative Ayanna Presley, which would be a complete redo of the impact of that, which would of course lead to decarceration, the going beyond decriminalization of marijuana to make sure that there's retroactivity embedded in that, so that folks can get their lives back, because just an interesting number. We currently spend $2.3 billion annually just holding people for marijuana charges. Just marijuana. Like, we're talking about just that on the federal level. And so I think it's important for us to kind of understand where those finances are. So that's what I can name in terms of that. Those two candidates are Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren.
We have another question.
My question is, Terrence Cribbs Laurent with the City of Miami Black Police Precinct Courthouse Museum, Executive Director and Curator. Doc, I want to thank you for being here and sharing the scorecard. I think it has been brought up a number of times, the importance of local election, local election, local election. I want to know, how can we use this scorecard to adapt it to our current climate and to those that are running in our local election? Is there an opportunity for us to drill down on some of the issues that are specific, like one, climate change, and how we can address this a little bit further? And my second question, if I can throw it in there, if there's any opportunity for us to move this conversation from here to our high schools, and how we're about to do that, because I believe that understanding that 16 is a registered opportunity to vote, register to vote, but 18 is the opportunity to make that vote. We need to have that conversation to address these 30 and 40 years. So I'd like to know if any panel is doing anything in those areas of our high schools, junior high schools.
Thanks for that question. So the scorecard, we cover, the presidential election, but the issues that are in the scorecard matter everywhere. And a lot of the issues, particularly some of them, particularly around the criminal justice reform, like most of the advocacy has been happening at the local level. And so like ending cash bail, like those are really like local issues that you've seen organizing happening around the country around. So you can take all of the issues, and I would like to argue that the scorecard could be applied, for local elections as well. There are actually some places, for example, in Chicago, the name of the organization escapes me. I think it's the Center for Gender and Racial Equity. They do a local scorecard that's very similar as well, where they look at the local candidates through this racial equity lens. And so for us, what we have to learn how to flex this racial equity analysis, right? Wherever we are, in whatever spaces that we're working in, right? It's transferable, right? And so that's what we do at CURE, is we work with organizations, we work with government agencies to understand what does it actually mean to actually apply a racial equity lens. And so this was a test case for us to apply it to an election. It's the same thing, right? So that we're speaking the same language wherever we are. We want to see that there's an acknowledgement of historic injustices, historic racial inequity, racism. We want to see that name. We want to see policies that are directly targeted to address those inequities, right? So that you can't just be neutral about it, right? Because this is not a neutral issue. We didn't get where we are being neutral, right? So there was a consistent, systemic effort, right, to create racialized outcomes. And so we have to be specific, we have to target in order to reverse, in order to create new outcomes, new possibilities. And so that's what we talk about when we talk about racial equity, and that we have to really look at what are the current policies, and what are how do you really break down those policies and see how they're impacting our communities and our populations. So we apply this lens within organizations. So a lot of organizations will contact us and say they want to do racial equity work. They've been working on diversity. And we say, we don't do diversity, we do racial equity. And so if you want to have a diversity conversation, that's a conversation that we don't have. We're going to really talk about, we're going to go in there, we're going to talk about white supremacy, we're going to talk about how that's showing up within your organization. Why do you have an organization that serves primarily black and brown people, but the leadership is all white? So that's not an accident. And so we see these processes reproduce themselves in every organization, every government agency. And so those are the type of conversations that we have to have, whether we're working on education policy locally, whether we're working on criminal justice reform, whether we're working on housing, right? All across the board, we need to be applying this lens.
We're doing work in high schools, so If you are a teacher, know a teacher, we're looking for invitations into the classroom. We are a third-party registrant, so we can register high school age students, but we need the invitation. So anyone who's willing to invite us, we're
Yeah, and I would say the same thing for the Black Collective as well. We do trainings with youth. We partner with different youth organizations. So actually on Saturday, we're doing a 9-to-5 training, getting ready for the Black girls at the Capitol in Tallahassee. They're mobilizing up, and so we're doing a 9-to-5 training with their youth, basically teaching about the legislative process, how to tell their stories, how to deal with the triggers of telling their stories. And so we've developed a whole 8-hour curriculum to train our youth on breaking down the legislative process, understanding elections. We actually do a Jeopardy game with them at the end of it to make sure that they actually retain the information, taking into different ways that people learn visually, audially. So there's definitely opportunities to engage.
I just wanted to add also just to what Francesca was saying, and speaking to one of the questions that came earlier, is that it's really important to make sure that we're standing in our own leadership and taking our power, right? Because there's so much capacity that the organizations, grassroots organizations and community have trying to work for social equity across the board. And so it's as important for all of our community members to make sure that you're recognizing and standing in your power and doing the things that you can do also. So that if that means looking around the room and acknowledging and noticing that somebody is not sitting next to you that should be, that might need the information, that might need some of the resources that are here, making sure that that becomes available to the community so that we have more people that can come to the polls educated and ready to make really good decisions that will create that racial justice and social equity and transformation that we need across our communities.
And also letting you know we don't limit it just to kids. So I'm also going to be doing one of the Jeopardy games at the North Miami Adult Center for their entire school on March 5th around the census. So it's literally on whatever topic we want our people to be able to retain the information. So I'm going to be doing that on March 5th with the Black Collective and Community Strategies at North Miami Adult Center. So it's like, again, if the invitation is extended, let's have a conversation. Let's figure out what is it that we want them to actually retain, and we will, develop a curriculum around it.
Good evening. My name is Cortez Maria Lewis, and I'm the Director of Advocacy for Women's March Miami. Terrence asked a question pertaining a scorecard. We are actually working on that now locally. We've done it statewide in the last elections. So if anyone is interested, please see me or our director, Carrie, who's up front. We're actively working that out now.
Well, thank you guys. You've been a great audience. It's 8:30, and we know that many of you want to go across the street or wherever you might go to watch the debate. Please join me in thanking our panel. And thank you for your attention and your questions.
I want to thank you on behalf of NTC and the South Florida people of color. It is the light you bring to this world, the energy you are putting out in this world. It gives me hope when it sometimes is so dark and so difficult to find a spark these days. Thank you, thank you, thank you for the work that you do.